It was a cold evening in April 1945. The war was nearly over, but the hatred still burned like a dying fire refusing to fade. A convoy of trucks rumbled down a muddy German road. Inside them, dozens of captured German soldiers sat in silence, their faces hollow, their uniforms torn and stained with surrender. Outside, the world was collapsing. Villages lay in ruins, chimneys still smoking, windows shattered. American GIs drove cautiously, watching the empty fields. But they weren't alone. Word had spread. The Germans are coming through. And the locals, still raw with grief from years of bombings and loss, gathered on the roadside. Some carried shovels, others pitchforks, a few even rifles left behind by retreating troops. They didn't see prisoners. They saw monsters, men who had killed their sons, destroyed their homes, and burned their cities. The air thickened with rage. As the first stone hit a truck's windshield, an American guard named Sergeant John Simmons shouted for the convoy to stop. He saw the mob approaching, faces twisted in fury. He knew one wrong move could turn this road into a massacre. The easy choice was to drive on, to let vengeance run its course. But Simmons did something else. He stepped down from the truck, unarmed, and walked straight toward the mob. The war might have ended on paper, but here, on this road, one man was about to fight a different kind of battle. The battle for humanity itself. Spring 1945. Europe was a continent of ashes. The Reich was collapsing from every direction, Soviet armies closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Town after town surrendered under the thunder of artillery, and millions of people, soldiers and civilians alike, were wandering through the wreckage, looking for safety, food, or forgiveness. You can see it. Germany divided by advancing arrows. Allied columns moving through Bavaria, Thuringia, Saxony. Every mile brought new surrenders. The war was ending, but peace hadn't yet learned how to begin. Among the countless prisoners, captured were men of the Wehrmacht. Not fanatical SS, not high-ranking officers, just exhausted soldiers who had fought too long and understood it was over. They were loaded onto trucks and driven to temporary holding camps across Germany, guarded by American soldiers who, only weeks earlier, had fought them in forests, fields, and ruined cities. Orders from the U.S. Army were clear. Treat prisoners, humanely protect them, and keep them alive until repatriation. But not everyone outside the army felt the same. In many villages, locals had buried loved ones under rubble left by German bombers. They'd seen concentration camp survivors stumbling down roads like ghosts. To them, every man in a gray uniform was guilty. Every one of them deserved to pay. So when word spread that a group of German prisoners was being moved through their town, the grief turned to fury. Mobs formed quickly. Stones, clubs, shovels, even old hunting rifles. And there, in the middle of it, was Sergeant John Simmons, 26 years old, from Ohio. He'd fought through France and Belgium, seen death in Normandy, and watched friends fall beside him. He had every reason to hate the men in those trucks. But war had taught him something strange. That hate, left unchecked, never ends. Simmons had been assigned as convoy security, a routine job. Drive the prisoners, guard them, and deliver them safely. Yet nothing about this road felt routine. The faces in the crowd weren't enemy soldiers. They were civilians, angry, broken, and ready to take justice into their own hands. One of the other guards muttered, "If they rush us, we'll just drive through." Simmons shook his head. "If we do that, people die. Theirs and ours." He stepped out, waving his arms, yelling at the crowd to back off. No one listened. The shouting grew louder. Someone cocked a rifle. He had seconds to decide, obey fear or obey conscience. And that single choice, made on a nameless German road, would become one of the forgotten acts of courage in the closing days of World War II. For the rest of his life, John Simmons would remember the silence that followed. It wasn't victory. It wasn't peace. It was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones after years of seeing too much death. When the convoy finally reached the temporary camp, the officers demanded to know why he'd delayed the transport. He didn't talk about the mob or the stones or the gun pointed at his chest. He just said, "We ran into trouble on the road. It's taken care of." And that was it. But among the German prisoners, word spread quickly. They had been seconds from being slaughtered, not by soldiers, but by ordinary people. And the man who stopped it wasn't one of their own, but an enemy in uniform. That night, in the flickering light of the camp's oil lamps, one of the captured officers approached him. He didn't speak much English, but he saluted, then simply said, "Danke." Simmons nodded. "Just don't waste the chance you got today." In that small moment, a brief exchange between enemies, there was something more powerful than any surrender document signed in Reims or Berlin. It was understanding. While generals prepared their speeches and flags were raised in cities far away, men like Simmons were fighting the quieter, invisible battles, the ones for dignity, restraint, and conscience. Weeks later, when Germany finally fell, there were celebrations across the Allied lines. But Simmons didn't celebrate. He walked alone near the barbed wire of the POW camp, watching the German soldiers dig trenches for drainage, eyes lowered, silent. He thought of the crowd back in that village, the faces twisted with grief, and he thought of the young boy who had fallen in the mud, the one who'd survived because someone had decided not to hate. In his notebook, he wrote one line: "There are wars that end with surrender, and wars that end with mercy. The first changes borders. The second changes men." He closed the notebook and never mentioned it again. When he returned home to Ohio, no medals waited for him. His parents asked what it had been like over there. He smiled faintly and said, "Loud." Years later, one of his fellow guards wrote to him, a short letter that ended with a single sentence: "I still think about that day. You were right to stand your ground." History never recorded his act. No photograph, no newspaper, no citation for bravery. But for the men in those trucks, his name was never forgotten. Decades after the war, a German historian researching Allied conduct in post-war Europe found testimonies from surviving POWs. One described an American sergeant who faced down a crowd to save us. The historian tracked records, old rosters, faded signatures, and found him. When asked why he did it, Simmons, then in his 80s, paused for a long time and said quietly, "Because it had to end somewhere." That was all. In the chaos of war, there are countless acts of courage that never make it into the books. The ones done without witnesses, without cameras, without reward. Simmons' road, muddy and forgotten, was one of them. He didn't just stop a mob that day. He stopped the war from taking one more piece of humanity. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, Europe exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Smoke still lingered over bombed cities. Church bells rang for the first time in years, and people emerged cautiously from basements and shelters, half believing the silence, half fearing it wouldn't last. What was left of the continent was a graveyard of nations, broken bridges, shattered families, and millions of stories too painful to tell. And somewhere among those ruins, one American soldier carried a story he would never speak aloud. Sergeant John Simmons returned home a month after the surrender. He didn't return as a hero or a headline, just another face in the crowd stepping off a troop ship, duffel bag in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The war had ended, but the noise of it stayed inside him. He had seen what people became when hate was given permission to rule. Not just soldiers, but ordinary men and women who had lost everything and wanted to make someone else pay. Back in Ohio, the world moved on. There were parades, victory flags, and rationing cards thrown into bonfires. But Simmons didn't go to the parades. He unpacked quietly, found work at a local hardware store, and spent his evenings fixing broken things: chairs, radios, lawnmowers, as if mending the world one bolt at a time. To his neighbors, he was calm and polite, always ready to help, rarely talking about himself, but those who knew him well said he carried a look, not haunted exactly, but distant, like someone who had seen too much of the truth. When asked about the war, he would smile faintly and say, "It was loud." And that was all. The incident on that muddy German road never appeared in his reports. There was no official recognition, no witness statement. But among the German prisoners he had saved, it became something else entirely. A whispered story of the American Guard who risked his life to stop vengeance when vengeance was the easiest choice in the world. Years later, one of those prisoners, a young boy then, barely 17 at the time, rebuilt his life in a divided Germany. He became a teacher, married, and raised a family. Every year, when he told his students about the war, he ended the lesson with the same words. "I am alive because one man remembered that mercy is also a weapon, one that doesn't kill, but heals." He would never forget Simmons' voice, calm and firm in the chaos, or the way he stood between life and death without a rifle in his hand. In 1964, that same man, now in his late 30s, began writing letters to the U.S. Army Archives, searching for the sergeant who had saved him. The replies were polite but fruitless. No record of the incident found. He never stopped searching. And in a way, that search became part of the story. Proof that even when history forgets, memory doesn't. Meanwhile, Simmons grew older. He married a nurse named Ellen, raised 2 children, and quietly avoided anything that reminded him of the war. He never joined veterans groups, never told his story, never hung his uniform on display. To his kids he was simply Dad, the man who could fix anything. But every now and then, when he thought no one was watching, he'd sit on the porch and stare at the sunset for hours, the same way he had stared down that angry crowd years ago. One summer afternoon, his son found an old, weathered notebook inside the trunk at the foot of his bed. Inside, in faded pencil, was a single line: "There are wars that end with surrender, and wars that end with mercy." That was all it said. No names, no dates, no details. Just that one sentence. Simple, but powerful enough to explain a lifetime of silence. When Simmons passed away in 1989, there were no medals pinned on his coffin, no generals at his funeral. Just family, a few old neighbors, and a folded flag handed to his widow. To most people, he was just another veteran, one among millions who had served. But somewhere across the Atlantic, an old man in Germany lit a candle by his window and whispered a quiet prayer for the stranger who had once saved his life. That man's grandson, now a historian, continued the search his grandfather had started. In 2015, while combing through declassified U.S. Army transport logs, he finally found a report mentioning a delayed convoy near Thuringia, led by a Sergeant J. Simmons. It was brief, just one line. Delayed due to civilian interference, resolved without casualties. For decades, that single sentence had been buried under paperwork, but in its few words lay an entire act of courage, one that history had never recorded, yet humanity had never forgotten. When the grandson was later interviewed for a documentary, he said something that echoed across generations. "People think history is made by generals and presidents, but sometimes it's made by the man who chooses not to pull the trigger." That's what John Simmons did. He didn't change the map of Europe. He didn't end the war. But on one forgotten road, he refused to let hate claim another victory. And maybe that's how wars truly end. Not when treaties are signed, but when one person decides that killing in any form has gone far enough. The tragedy of war is that it exposes the worst in humanity. The miracle of mercy is that it proves the best still survives. And amid the ruins, in every corner of a world trying to heal, people like Simmons remind us that decency, quiet, unrecorded, uncompromising, is the only victory that ever lasts. He never called himself a hero. But heroes rarely do. They just do what must be done and leave the world quietly better than they found it. And so, in the final ledger of World War II, Beyond the tanks and treaties, there exists one more entry, unwritten but eternal. An American soldier stood between hate and humanity, and chose the latter. When the last echoes of that war finally faded into the wind, the earth buried its scars, the oceans calmed, and in the silence that followed, humanity remembered itself.